They said some marriages begin with love, but mine began with silence that felt like a sentence I could never appeal. My name is Emily Carter, and I was 26 when I signed a contract that handed my future to a man the city of Chicago called the Ghost. Richard Coleman was 65, a name spoken only in lowered voices and closed doors, a man whose presence seemed to make even time hesitate. I had never met him until the day of the arrangement, and when I did, he did not greet me, did not smile, did not even acknowledge that I was standing less than 10 feet away. The mansion they brought me to sat on the edge of Lake Michigan, too large to feel like a home and too quiet to feel real, as if it had been built to hold secrets rather than people. The wedding had no music that I could remember, only the faint sound of fabric moving and the soft shuffle of signatures being completed like legal fate being sealed. I remember holding the pen with hands that felt too small for the weight of what I was agreeing to, while Richard stood beside me like a shadow that had learned how to breathe. No vows were exchanged in the way I once imagined when I was younger, no promises of love or forever, only a mutual understanding that this was not a beginning but an arrangement shaped by forces I had never been allowed to see. When it ended, I was escorted into a hallway lined with paintings of unfamiliar faces, each one watching me as if they already knew how this story would unfold. Richard walked ahead of me without turning back, his step steady, measured, controlled, like a man who had long since decided that emotions were unnecessary distractions. I followed because there was nothing else to do, each step echoing softly against marble floors that reflected a version of me I did not recognize. That night, I was told only one rule would matter: stay inside the room after midnight. No explanation was given, no warning beyond that, and in a house where every wall seemed to listen, I learned quickly that questions were not invited. I stood alone by the window for a long time, watching the distant lights of Chicago flicker like a city that never learned how to sleep, wondering how a life could change so quietly and still feel so absolute. And somewhere in that silence, I realized I was not here to be loved or feared, but to become part of something I did not yet understand. Because in that house, nothing was ever given without a reason, and even silence felt like it had been carefully designed to test what kind of person I would become when no one was watching. And I did not know yet that Richard Coleman had been waiting for me long before I ever arrived. The house felt different as the evening settled deeper into the night, as if the walls themselves were adjusting to the absence of daylight and becoming more aware of everything inside them. I stayed in my room longer than I intended, sitting at the edge of the bed with my hands folded tightly in my lap, listening to the faint rhythm of a distant clock that seemed too slow to be real. Every sound in the mansion carried farther than it should have, the soft creak of wood, the low hum of air moving through vents, even my own breathing felt louder than it should in a place this large. I told myself that rules were just rules, that people who lived in worlds like this one made rules to create order, not mystery, but the thought did nothing to calm the tension growing inside me. When I finally stood, it was because I could no longer tell whether waiting was safer than moving. I opened the door carefully, expecting nothing, yet the hallway outside felt different from earlier in the day. The lights were dimmer now, casting longer shadows that stretched across the floor like they were reaching for something unseen. I took a slow step forward, then another, each one measured as if the house might react to me if I moved too quickly. That was when I noticed something I had not seen before, a door at the far end of the corridor that seemed too narrow compared to the rest of the architecture, almost like it had been added later or hidden intentionally. It was not marked with anything, no number, no name, just a plain surface that blended almost too well with the wall around it. I stopped walking, staring at it longer than I should have, because something about it felt wrong in a way I could not explain. I was still trying to convince myself to turn back when I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, steady, deliberate. I turned around and saw Richard Coleman standing at the end of the hall, his presence as still as the air itself. He was not close enough to feel threatening, but somehow the distance did not matter. He simply looked at me for a moment without speaking, as if measuring not what I was doing, but what I was thinking. I expected him to tell me to go back to my room, to remind me of the rule, but instead he said nothing at all. That silence carried more weight than any instruction could have. He shifted his gaze toward the narrow door, and for the first time since I had met him, I saw something in his expression that did not feel controlled. It was not anger, not warmth, but something far more complicated, something that looked like memory trying not to surface. I did not ask questions, because I understood instinctively that questions would not be answered here. Instead, I simply stood there, caught between the man I barely knew and the door I was not supposed to notice. And in that moment, I began to realize that the rules of this house were not meant to protect me from danger, but to protect something else from being remembered. The moment Richard Coleman did not ask me to leave felt heavier than any command he could have spoken. He remained at the far end of the corridor, still and unreadable, as if time itself had decided to pause around him. I could feel my own thoughts becoming louder than the house, questions forming and collapsing before they could become words. The narrow door remained in my vision like an error in reality, something that did not belong but refused to disappear. I did not move toward it, yet I also did not step back. Instead, I stood in a strange middle space where hesitation became its own kind of answer. Richard finally took a slow step forward, not toward me, not away from me, but toward the door itself. His presence changed the air, not in a dramatic way, but in a subtle shift that made the silence feel more intentional. He stopped a few feet from the door and lowered his gaze to it, as if acknowledging something that had been waiting for him longer than I had existed in his world. I noticed his hands were steady, but there was a tension in his posture that had not been there before, something restrained rather than calm. For the first time, I felt that he was not controlling the situation, but managing something already in motion. I wanted to ask what was behind it, but the words never formed. Instead, I watched as he slowly reached out and placed his hand near the edge of the door without opening it. He did not touch the handle. It was as if even contact was a decision too significant to make lightly. After a long silence, he spoke in a voice so controlled it almost blended into the air. He said the door had not been opened in a very long time, and that some parts of a life were not meant to be revisited, not because they were dangerous, but because they were unfinished. His words did not clarify anything, yet they made the space feel even more real, as if the house itself had been listening for a reason. I shifted my weight slightly, unsure whether I was allowed to remain, but he did not tell me to leave. Instead, he finally looked at me directly, and in that moment I saw something I had not seen before, not authority, not distance, but something closer to exhaustion wrapped in restraint. It was the kind of expression that belonged to someone carrying memories too heavy to name out loud. He turned his attention back to the door and said that some truths do not stay buried because they are hidden, but because they are protected by the people who cannot afford to lose them again. The words did not feel like an explanation. They felt like a warning that had already been lived through once before. I realized then that this house was not simply holding secrets, it was preserving them. And I was not being kept outside of that door because I was not allowed in, but because my presence meant the past was no longer guaranteed to stay where it belonged. The silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full of something I could not yet understand, and for the first time since arriving, I understood that I was not just living inside this place, I was becoming part of its unanswered questions. Time in the mansion never felt like it followed the same rules as the outside world, and as the night grew deeper, I began to understand why silence here was treated almost like law. I stayed in my room longer than I intended again, not because I was told to, but because I could feel the weight of the house shifting with each passing minute, as if something important only began when the rest of the world stopped paying attention. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each sound sharper than it should have been, marking a boundary I did not fully understand but could feel approaching. Richard Coleman had not spoken again since we stood in the corridor, and yet his silence felt like it had expanded into every corner of the mansion. I kept thinking about his expression, about the way his control had briefly softened when he looked at the hidden door, and how that moment felt less like authority and more like restraint built over a long period of time. When the clock finally approached midnight, I realized I was no longer able to remain still. I stood up slowly, listening for anything that might suggest I was not alone in moving through the house, but there was only quiet. I opened my door with careful hands and stepped into the hallway again, noticing immediately that the air felt colder, as if the temperature itself had lowered to discourage movement. The dim lighting had not changed, yet everything felt more defined, every shadow more deliberate, every corner more aware. I moved forward slowly, guided by something I could not name, until I reached the narrow door once again. It was still closed, still silent, yet it felt different now, as if the house was no longer pretending I had not seen it. I reached out before I could fully convince myself not to, but before my fingers could touch the surface, I heard a sound behind me. This time, Richard did not appear suddenly. He was already there, standing at a distance that felt intentional, as if he had been watching long enough to know exactly when I would reach this point. He did not speak immediately, and neither did I. The silence between us felt more fragile now, less like distance and more like something that could break if either of us moved incorrectly. He finally asked, in a calm but controlled voice, why I was still awake, and I could not answer in a way that made sense even to myself. Instead of repeating the rule, he looked past me toward the door, and I noticed again that same tension in his expression, the kind that suggested memory rather than anger. After a long pause, he said that some hours of the night do not belong to the living in the same way the rest of the day does, and that certain doors are not locked to keep people out, but to keep something from returning. I did not ask what he meant, because I already understood that answers here were not given easily. Instead, I turned slightly and saw for the first time that there was a faint line around the doorframe, almost invisible, as if it had been sealed with time rather than material. Richard stepped closer, not to stop me, but to stand beside me, and in that moment I realized that whatever was behind that door was not only part of his past, but part of something he was still trying not to lose. And as the house continued its quiet breathing around us, I understood that I was no longer just a visitor in this silence, I was standing at the edge of something that had been waiting for me long before I ever arrived. The moment after Richard Coleman stood beside me, the silence did not feel empty anymore, it felt shared, as if the house itself was listening to both of us breathe at the same time. I kept my eyes on the faint outline of the sealed door, but my attention was no longer fully on it, because something in Richard's presence had shifted the meaning of the space around us. He did not move to stop me, yet he also did not encourage me forward, and that in-between state felt more powerful than any command he had ever given. After a long pause, he finally spoke again, not with authority, but with a quieter tone that carried something closer to hesitation. He said that people often believe silence is absence, but in his experience, silence is where the most important things are preserved. I did not respond, because I was beginning to understand that his words were not meant to be answered, but to be absorbed slowly over time. For a brief moment, he turned his head slightly away from the door, and I noticed something I had not paid attention to before, a small framed photograph resting on a narrow table at the end of the hallway. It was not hidden, but it was placed with care, as if it belonged there more than anything else in the house. I walked a few steps closer, drawn by curiosity rather than intention, and saw that the photograph showed a group of people gathered in what looked like a community space, not a place of power or wealth, but something simple and human, like a small center or shelter. Richard did not stop me from looking, and when I glanced back at him, I saw that his expression had changed again, not into something distant, but into something deeply contained, like a memory he had learned to live beside rather than inside. He said quietly that not everything in a life like his was built from darkness, even if the world preferred to believe it was. His voice carried no defense, only truth spoken carefully. I looked back at the photograph and noticed something I had missed at first, a younger version of him standing at the edge of the group, not as someone separate, but as someone present among people who seemed to trust him without hesitation. That image conflicted with everything I thought I knew about him, and yet it felt real in a way that could not be easily dismissed. The sealed door behind us suddenly felt less like a barrier and more like a boundary between what had been lost and what had been preserved. I asked, almost without thinking, if the door was connected to the photograph, and for the first time he did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at it again, and when he finally spoke, he said that some parts of life are not secrets because they are shameful, but because they are fragile, and that protecting them sometimes means hiding them from time itself. I stood there, realizing that the house was not simply filled with mystery, but with something far more complex, a history that had been carefully kept intact through silence rather than force. And in that moment, I understood that Richard Coleman was not only a man defined by power, but also a man shaped by everything he had chosen to preserve, even if the world outside had never been allowed to see it. The following morning arrived without announcement, as if the mansion had decided the night was enough and the day would continue only out of obligation. I woke to the same stillness I had begun to recognize as normal, a kind of silence that did not feel empty anymore, but carefully maintained. The light through the window was pale and controlled, filtering through heavy curtains in a way that made everything inside the room feel slightly distant, as if even daylight was being asked to behave quietly. I found myself thinking about the photograph again, about the younger version of Richard Coleman standing among people who looked at him without fear, and that thought stayed with me as I eventually stepped into the hallway. The house was already awake, but not alive in the way a home should be. It felt more like a structure remembering itself in pieces. I walked slowly, following the path I had taken the night before, until I reached the narrow corridor where the sealed door still stood unchanged. Richard was not there when I arrived, but the presence of him still felt embedded in the space, as if he had never fully left it. I stood in front of the door again, noticing something new in the morning light, faint marks along the edges that looked less like damage and more like repeated attention, as if someone had returned to this place many times without ever opening it. When I turned, I saw Richard approaching from the far end of the hall. He moved differently in daylight, less like a shadow and more like a man carrying structure within himself. He stopped a few feet away, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Then he asked if I had slept, not as a question of concern, but as if measuring continuity. I answered honestly that I had, though not deeply, and he nodded once, as if that information mattered more than I understood. After a pause, I told him I had seen the photograph. The reaction was subtle, not surprise, but acknowledgement, like something already known had finally been spoken aloud. He looked past me toward the door and said that what I saw was not meant to be hidden forever, only preserved until it could be understood without distortion. His voice carried no pride, only a careful kind of responsibility. I asked him, carefully, what kind of place that photograph represented, and for the first time he did not answer immediately with distance or avoidance. Instead, he walked past me slowly and stopped near the wall where the photograph was placed, as if standing closer to it made the memory easier to carry. He explained that years ago, before names like his became associated with power and distance, there were efforts to build spaces for people who had nowhere else to go, places that were not about control but about stability. He said that those efforts did not disappear because they failed, but because life in his world rarely allowed things built with sincerity to remain untouched. I listened without interrupting, realizing that this version of him was not separate from the one I had been learning about, but layered beneath it, carefully contained rather than erased. When he finished speaking, the silence that followed felt different again, not heavy this time, but reflective, as if the house itself had shifted slightly to accommodate what had been revealed. I looked back at the sealed door and understood, with a clarity I had not expected, that not every secret in this place was meant to protect guilt or fear. Some were meant to protect memory from being reshaped into something it was never meant to become. And in that quiet understanding, I began to see that Richard Coleman was not only living beside his past, he was still trying to keep it intact long enough for someone else to finally understand it without breaking it apart. The afternoon light in the mansion felt softer than it had in previous days, as if even the sun outside had learned not to push too strongly against the walls of this place. I found myself standing again in the same corridor without fully deciding to, my steps carrying me there out of a quiet sense of return rather than intention. Richard Coleman was already there when I arrived, positioned near the familiar sealed door, but this time he was not facing it. Instead, he stood slightly turned away, as if he had been waiting for something that required more than patience to arrive. When he saw me, he did not speak immediately. There was a different kind of stillness between us now, one that felt less like distance and more like recognition. I looked at the door, then back at him, and for reasons I could not fully explain, I no longer felt afraid of asking questions. I told him that I did not understand why something built from care had to remain locked away as if it were dangerous. My voice was steady, but it surprised even me that it carried no hesitation. Richard did not respond at first, and in that silence I noticed something unusual in him, not authority, not control, but restraint that looked almost like uncertainty. After a long pause, he said that not everything preserved in silence survives unchanged, and that sometimes distance is the only way to keep meaning intact. I listened, but this time I did not accept the answer as final. I told him that preservation without understanding eventually becomes another form of loss, even if it looks like protection. The words left my mouth before I could soften them, and for a moment I thought I had crossed a line I could not return from. But Richard did not react with anger or dismissal. Instead, he looked at me in a way that felt deeply human, as if he was seeing not only what I said, but why I said it. The air between us shifted again, not dramatically, but enough that I became aware that the balance of this place was no longer resting entirely on him. I stepped closer to the door, not touching it, but standing near it in a way that felt deliberate. I said that if something had been built to protect memory, then keeping it sealed forever might be a way of forgetting rather than honoring it. Richard closed his eyes briefly, as if those words had reached somewhere he had avoided for a long time. When he opened them again, there was no resistance in his expression, only something quieter, something that looked like the beginning of reconsideration. He finally said that he had spent years believing control was the same as responsibility, and that letting go of that belief felt like stepping into uncertainty without structure. I told him that responsibility could also mean allowing truth to exist without being controlled by fear of what it might become. The silence that followed was different from all the others I had experienced in this house. It did not feel imposed or protective. It felt like space opening rather than closing. Richard turned slightly toward the sealed door, but this time he did not stand between it and me. Instead, he stepped aside just enough that I could see it fully without obstruction. And in that simple movement, I understood something shifting between us that was not about power or permission, but about trust forming in a place where trust had never been offered freely. For the first time since arriving, I felt that this house was not only holding his past, but waiting to see whether it could also hold something new without breaking. The moment I stopped expecting the house to remain unchanged was the moment everything inside it began to feel more honest. The corridor no longer carried the same tension it once did, and even the silence seemed less like a warning and more like an invitation to finally understand what had been left unresolved for too long. I stood near the sealed door again, but this time Richard Coleman did not position himself between me and it. He remained slightly behind me, not guarding the space, not controlling it, but simply existing within it as someone who was no longer trying to resist what was about to be understood. I could feel that something in him had already shifted, not abruptly, but gradually, like a long-held weight beginning to loosen its grip. I placed my hand near the edge of the door, not forcing it, not demanding it to open, but acknowledging it in the same way one acknowledges a truth that has waited long enough. Richard did not speak, but I could sense his attention fully on that moment, as if the decision was no longer his to control alone. The air felt still, but not heavy, more like a pause the world had agreed to respect. When the door finally moved, it was not dramatic or sudden. It opened slowly, as if time itself needed to adjust to what it had been protecting. What I saw on the other side was not what I expected, not something hidden in fear, but something preserved with care, a space that held fragments of a life that had once mattered deeply. There were objects arranged with intention, not wealth or power, but memory, quiet reminders of purpose that had not been allowed to disappear completely. Richard stepped forward slightly, but only enough to stand beside me, and for the first time I saw him not as a figure defined by distance, but as someone standing inside the consequence of his own history. He said nothing at first, and I understood that words would not come easily here. I asked him quietly why this place had been hidden instead of shared, and his answer came slowly, as if he was choosing each part of it carefully. He said that there were moments in life that shaped who a person became, but the world outside rarely allows those moments to be understood without judgment. He said that what he had tried to protect was not a secret, but a version of himself that had once believed in building something meaningful without losing it to the world that followed. I looked around the space again and realized it did not feel like something broken or lost, but something unfinished, waiting not for perfection, but for acknowledgement. I told him that preserving something does not require hiding it, and that truth does not lose value when it is seen by others, it only becomes shared. For the first time, I saw a faint change in his expression, not relief exactly, but something closer to acceptance that did not need control to exist. He nodded slightly, as if agreeing not with a decision, but with a possibility he had not allowed himself to consider before. As we stood there together, the house no longer felt like it was separating past from present, but allowing them to exist in the same space without conflict. I realized then that what had been locked away was never meant to stay hidden forever, only long enough for someone to understand it without fear. And in that understanding, I saw not just his past, but a future that no longer required silence to survive. Standing inside the space that had been hidden for so long, I realized that nothing about it felt like the ending of a secret, but more like the beginning of understanding something that had been waiting patiently to be seen. Richard Coleman remained beside me, no longer positioned as someone guarding a boundary, but as someone finally willing to exist within the truth of what he had once protected alone. The air in the room felt different from the rest of the mansion, not heavy and not cold, but quietly suspended, as if time itself had loosened its hold just enough for clarity to enter. I walked slowly through the space, noticing how everything inside had been preserved with intention rather than fear. There were documents carefully stored, photographs placed with respect, and small objects that carried meaning rather than status. Nothing here felt like power. It felt like memory given structure so it would not disappear. Richard spoke softly behind me, saying that he had built parts of his life trying to separate what the world demanded from what he believed was worth protecting, and over time the separation had become something he no longer knew how to undo. His voice carried no attempt to justify or defend, only recognition of a long path that had led to isolation he never fully named. I turned toward him and said that protection without connection eventually becomes another form of distance, even when it begins with good intention. He did not disagree. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if accepting a truth that had been present long before it was spoken. I told him that nothing meaningful survives in isolation forever, not because it is weak, but because it is meant to be understood in context, not hidden from it. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, and in that silence something important changed, not in the room, but between us. The walls no longer felt like they were separating past from present, but holding both within the same space without conflict. Richard finally said that he had spent years believing that control was necessary to preserve meaning, but what he had preserved most carefully had also remained the most distant from him. His words were not heavy, only honest, as if spoken by someone who no longer needed to argue with his own history. I looked around once more and understood that this place was never about secrecy in the way I first assumed, but about an attempt to keep identity intact when everything outside demanded it be rewritten. I told him that maybe preservation is not about stopping change, but about allowing truth to remain recognizable even as life continues forward. He looked at me for a long time without speaking, and I could see something settling in him that had not been there before, not resolution in the dramatic sense, but acceptance without resistance. When we eventually walked back into the hallway together, the mansion no longer felt like a structure built around silence, but like a place that had finally begun to release it. The narrow door remained open behind us, not as a symbol of exposure, but as proof that not everything hidden needs to stay closed to remain meaningful. And as I stood beside Richard Coleman in that quiet corridor, I understood that what had begun as distance had transformed into something neither of us had expected, not ownership, not control, but a shared willingness to let truth exist without fear of what it might change.